Good afternoon. I'm delighted to have Dr. Ganesh Vignaraja here with us this afternoon. He is an economist, has had many years of experience in the policy framework, economic development with ADB in Tokyo, in the private sector in London, and basically works on the area of trade and competitiveness and macroeconomic policy. Is widely published, has published more than 12.5 books on different subjects, and is currently the executive director of the LKI, Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute in Colombo. What Ganesh has been working on at the Institute is about the Indian Ocean economies. We are all familiar with BIMSTEC, and we are familiar with the Indian Ocean Rim Association and things like that. But what Ganesh is trying to do is to try and look at it as in a holistic fashion, which is not easy to do because the economies involved are very different, both in terms of levels of economic development, say Singapore on one side, Australia on one side, and others. You have economies which are oil and gas producers on one side, so island economies, small states, etc., etc. So there is an enormous divergence, and I, being a non-economist, I guess, I'm not sure if all of this actually comes together as a growth pole, and maybe that is one reason why we don't really have any institutional platform which actually encompasses all of them together, perhaps because of their very divergence. And secondly, of course, is the other reason that comes to mind, which is the growing rivalries that are now playing out in these waters, Indo-Pacific, and we are seeing that the influence of those rivalries, which in a sense also prevent the creation, because then if you create a platform and that platform actually becomes a stage for playing out of major rivalries, and so that's another issue. So I'm not sure if we can look at the Indian Ocean economy as a new global growth pole, but then he puts a question mark at the end of it. So maybe he also has some doubts about how to make it work. But I think I'll leave it at that and hand the floor to Ganesh.
Thank you very much. I really am delighted to be here at the ORF today, and I'm very grateful to Rakesh Sood for having me here, chance to talk to you all. This presentation essentially is an iteration of a working paper published by the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies in Sri Lanka. And I thought I would kind of try to make it more interesting for you all by sort of putting a spin on this global economy that is sort of in recovery mode in some sense. Some people say tepid. And then I thought I'll talk a little bit with the spotlight on India and Sri Lanka. And that's a little bit of a brave thing, and I feel trepidation coming to an Indian audience, but allow me the indulgence of sort of giving you some thoughts from this angle. So the storyline is this Indian Ocean, isn't it? And you all have done a lot of work at this ORF. It's one of the world's busiest trade routes, fueled by China's rapid growth. And so we have this east-west corridor of trade that's very important, with the value chain on the one hand, but also goods trade and services trade. But of course, as has been pointed out in ORF work, it's becoming kind of a little bit less stable and has a question mark on the governance of it, right? Governance in a political economy sense, but also in a legal, institutional, geopolitical sense. So kind of with this kind of backdrop, I guess I want to sort of leave 3 developments that might kind of motivate this talk. The first is really, the rise of this ocean, and that story is kind of well known to a lot of people in this room. And it's really a byproduct of Asia's economic rise and the rise of China. And the second kind of story really is one of a dampener. Everyone tells the up story, but the down bit is equally interesting and important, because that's something that's happened since the global financial crisis. And you see all the numbers trending downwards, right? And that's really interesting for us to look at.
And that's linked to this crisis in the maritime trade economy today. And that's interesting in terms of the sea trade. I'm going to show you some numbers on how much that has kind of changed. And then we have the whole kind of maritime security story, which is really linked to these traditional as well as non-traditional threats. And then you have the US who are kind of hoping that India will become a net security provider. So there's kind of tied in this economic and security dimension to this. And that's kind of naturally takes you to the Indo-Pacific idea that Rakesh so eloquently talked about. So what I want to try to tell you is a little bit of a story about how these sorts of developments are affecting the economic performance of the region, a bit about India and a bit about Sri Lanka in that kind of storyline, at two ends of the spectrum, and Sri Lanka is kind of the aspiring kind of trading hub. And then what we might want to think about in terms of strengthening the rules-based order in the Indian Ocean, particularly for the legal side and the rules-based side, but alongside the development of the zone of trade. Yeah? So I'm going to try to do 4 things today, and I'm going to try to do it quite briefly so we have some time for chat. I'm going to try to provide some way of looking at this Indian Ocean economy in terms of a concept, and I'm going to refer to the literature on international relations and strategic studies and what bits of that deals with the economics of this, because that's where I come from. That's the lens I'm applying to this. Then I'm going to try to map very briefly, regional economic performance in India and Sri Lanka in the context of this sea trade and the ocean-borne story. Then I'm going to try to do a little bit of projection to 2025 and what the region would look like in the world, what India might look like, what Sri Lanka would look like. And there are much more detailed numbers in the working paper if you want them. And then spend some time on these challenges, which are economic, geopolitical, and institutional. And then get a little bit to Sri Lanka's sort of diplomatic initiative based around a conference that Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe convened on the 11th and 12th of October last year. This was, about 2 weeks before this famous so-called constitutional coup that we had. So, it was a thrill ride for all of us. And, we now have a recalibration of that back to what it was before, but we have elections coming up, the regional elections, the provincial elections, we have presidential elections at the end of 2020, and we have parliamentary elections by 2020 summer. So we're in an interesting ride in which this small country is trying kind of this big diplomatic push. So I'll just try to do all this fairly quickly. So let me start with the measurement of this economy. Now, a lot of this literature has been conducted through the lens of international relations and strategic studies. And we tried, when we were doing the working paper, to sort of get a sense of how to categorize literature. And that's always quite difficult. But you have really 3 sort of key strands, the way I sort of tried to read this as a non-international relations strategic studies person, but then giving me the luxury of license, as you would say, to categorize different bits of thought. The first is this strategic rivalry, right, between major powers, maritime security and issues of that time and safety, and then this concept of collective security. You have a Gaul dialogue, you have something that India does, IONS, I think is what it's called.
Naval Symposium.
That's right, the Naval Symposium, etc., etc., etc. So there's a whole kind of a strand there, right, which looks at that issue and how one set of issues impinges upon the others, and the economics comes into play, particularly with the rise of China. A second bit of it is kind of a bit more related to the economics, which is about the blue economy, right, which is mapping the asset base of this ocean. They're looking at the fish stocks. They're looking at the natural resources, the minerals. They're looking at multinationals doing mining issues and deep sea exploration with oil and gas and issues of that type. And to the extent they look at economy, they're looking at the bits of those countries that have the ocean to it. Right? So you're looking a little bit at the fishing sector in a country, looking a bit at the green bit of a country, and so on. So that's a second important strand. Then there's a third strand that looks at the sort of governance, if you like, around it, which is let's look at IORA as a construct for regional cooperation and as a conduit. Let's look at Asia, Africa in that context. And they tried to highlight basically the regional disparities, right, between the richer countries and the poorer ones, and how do we, through better governance and this nascent Indian Ocean Rim Association, try to correct some of these things. right? But IRA is very small and very weak in terms of any kind of indicator that you might take. So the economics of some of this Indian Ocean economy as a growth pole is sort of missing. Now, of course, meanwhile, the IMF, the UN, the World Bank, they do very good country and macroeconomic analysis, but they don't look at this kind of construct of the Indian Ocean, spreading across Asia and the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, etc., because this is not a traditional grouping. But it's kind of interesting to kind of look at that. So what we tried to do was let's take stuff that we've been looking at in consent of, say, Asian integration or Asian macroeconomic analysis, and apply some of these tools to looking at this rather interesting non-traditional grouping. And there is a preliminary working paper that you can look at if you want the details of all of this. But I'm trying to go beyond the working paper, but some of it I will draw on in what I'm talking about. So what you get when you look at these 28 littoral states spread across the blue being Africa and the Middle East, the green being sort of South Asia, and the red being East Asia and the Pacific, any country that broadly touches this Indian Ocean in some sense. And some of it is a little bit elastic, but we got a construct that sort of seemed to make sense. And the interesting thing when you look at the numbers is it's quite a big grouping. I mean, 35% of the world's population, 16% of trade, 18.5, 19% of the world GDP, and so on. So you get an interesting kind of number when you look at it, and it becomes curious when you start looking at some of the numbers that come out of using this as a macro construct. Here is a story of the rise of the ocean. So you have in this table three basic indicators: trade volume growth, GDP growth, and then this third one, which is basically the ratio of trade growth to GDP growth, what some people talk about as the income elasticity of trade. And the story in the period from 2000 to 2008, but it would also mirror the period of the 1990s, is this kind of upturn, right, of this particular economy, linked to the era of hyper-globalization, as some people have called it.
Indian Ocean is all that green, blue, red, everything.
Yeah, everything.
It's only 9.5.
Yeah, that's what we get in terms of the number, in terms of its trade volume growth for this period. Percent per year. Huh? So it's still pretty good when you think about some of the numbers, but it comes down by the weighting. It's a weighted number, right? Essentially, you have hyperglobalization, you have technical change through FDI, you have falling trade barriers. There are a number of things that are causing this thing to grow in that early period. Then you have the global financial crisis, 2008-9, and that has quite a marked impact on dampening the period of performance after that. Right? You see that in the trade numbers. And then you see sort of the forecasts going forward in the next couple of years. And essentially you see a slight pickup, but the pace is slower than what you had during the faster period before, right? So we have this, so this is where the new normal comes in. Are we in some sort of structural break that is, in a new paradigm of developed country performance, which is also now mirroring in the developing world, okay? That's the point about this whole new normal story. So it's not going to grow as fast as we had before. And you get these different numbers, for trade growth elasticity. And the important thing for me was, you get this ratio, right? So this ratio was about 2 historically in the fast period, 1.5, 1.6, 1.7. And that was the period when trade was growing twice as fast as global GDP growth, and trade was expanding very rapidly, right? In the post-crisis period, the number for the Indian Ocean comes down to under 1, which is kind of worrying. You're kind of having trade playing less of an importance of this. And then there's this marginal pickup that you get going forward. Now, of course, when you look at the different countries, you get different bits to this. So India is seen by some people to kind of have this slight recovery in trade performance compared to the earlier period. And you have Sri Lanka, which has a slight down from this previous period. And then you have these numbers of growth and so on. And I know a lot of people in India are skeptical of the growth numbers, and that's a debate I've had and heard of before, particularly the 7.58% number. Some people say it's too high. In the Sri Lankan case, the 4.2 number, I sit on the central bank's monetary policy committee, and one of the things we've been debating is that the leading indicators of Sri Lanka's growth suggest a higher number than what it is. And there's partly a measurement problem. It's to do with the proxies that we use to calculate GDP. And there's a problem in our Central Statistical Office with some of the proxies and the surveys they have to do to get those proxies. And so we think that number is somewhat understated. They also rebased the number in 2010. So we think the Sri Lankan growth number is a bit higher. But the interesting point is you have some pickup, but it's changed from before. That's what I really wanted to kind of point out, right? Now, when we go further into this, you have, of course, the global risks are there as well for some of those forecasts. You have the US-China trade tensions, you have the debt and capital outflow issues, you have the China slowdown. So there are all these things on this horizon. So even this so-called new normal may be at some risk, especially if we get into 2020. I just want to underline that. Now, taking the sort of general slowdown as you might, this essentially shows you container traffic. So I wanted to capture the sea story, right? And one of the nice ways of capturing this is container traffic growth. And you have this 20-foot equivalent unit kind of thing. And this is a very nice volume indicator, right? Which the security people are very familiar with. For economists, this was quite fun to find some indicator of capturing this. And when you look at it for the Indian Ocean, you have this dramatic slowdown to about a third of the pace that it had, sorry, half the pace, under half, as to what it had before. And you look at the different countries, and you have the major ports, Dubai and Singapore, which are still the largest in terms of these TEUs. I mean, Singapore is quite impressive, 36 million TEUs. Dubai comes next. India is picking up. Sri Lanka will be around 8 TEUs. But the growth rates are kind of interesting. So the smaller ports, so not only have the larger ports kind of slowed, but there's been some pickup in the pace, relative pace of the smaller ports. And that's quite interesting. So I tried to go behind the numbers. And Colombo port story is very interesting. Just as a kind of a footnote as we go through this, it's one of the oldest ports in the Indian Ocean. It dates back to British rule. And it could reach 8 million TEUs if planned investments materialize. The sort of growth is really linked to three things. One is the strategic location along global sea lanes. And transshipment trade, 75% of the trade is transshipment. And that's obviously important. We've also had major investments to handle containerized cargo in the last few years, particularly since the 1980s. We have 4 new terminals, including a Chinese terminal, which is very interesting, as a CICT terminal, which is there. And they've also deepened the main channel to 15 to 18 meters. So the big ships can now come, and they've introduced private sector operators. So Colombo Port has gone through some interesting changes, and they're trying very hard to make some regulatory changes. So some of those changes also exist in Mombasa, and I know Chittagong is trying to look at some of these changes in Colombo Port as a kind of a model, for some of the developments. So the sea story is very interesting in terms of what one might see. Then when you sort of setting aside these geopolitical and economic risks of a trade war and so on, and if you assume a reasonable uptick of this region, taking the 2011 to 2017 numbers, you have the Indian Ocean becoming more important, even at a reduced pace of expansion, right? And what a business as usual scenario tells you is essentially an issue. So this region, and there are many more of these types of indicators in the working paper, and you can look at it for methodology and other things, but essentially the Indian Ocean will account for some 22% of global GDP by 2025, right, which is 6-7 years down the line. Its GDP per capita will make it well above middle income, the World Bank's definition of $4,000. It's well above middle income on average. Of course, there are differences amongst countries. Singapore, is one of the richest countries in Asia, $69,000, I guess. UAE becomes quite rich. India will double its per capita income. Sri Lanka does quite well, and so on and so forth. So you have some interesting changes. Now, this business as usual scenario, of course, has many challenges to it. Right? This is just a prediction. Like all forecasts, has a whole confidence interval around it and things of that type. And if I were doing this today, probably the numbers would be a bit lower, given the kind of multitude of risks that we are seeing. This paper we did, late last year. Now, there are probably at least 5 types of challenges we want to kind of highlight. And I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes in the few minutes I have left to kind of highlight some of these things. The first, it concerns barriers to trade and investment. A second one is about port quality and infrastructure investment, and the BRI is linked to that. We have development gaps and also middle income challenges, which are interesting. We have gaps in the regional architecture, and then we have maritime security. So there's a whole bunch of things that are there that can influence this sort of scenario going forward. Let me just mention the trade barriers a little bit, but not spend too much time on this. So there are barriers to trade and investment that remain in this region. The Indian Ocean as a whole has had quite a bit of reduction of trade. I'm sorry we didn't put the OECD numbers in. I meant to put those in, but we seem to have missed that. But overall, average tariffs have come down, and you see India's effort to liberalize its trade, and you see Sri Lanka, which has done that. Some of the other countries are more protected, but of course it's about non-tariff measures, right? Phytosanitary standards, customs procedures, technical barriers to trade, and so on, which anti-dumping measures, which are critical and very difficult to measure these things. These are headcount data, and they don't capture the incidence of tariffs, but they give you something. So you can see that this has steadily gone up. Services trade restrictiveness is high, and there are issues of behind-the-border regulatory barriers. And the sort of story that one thinks might be a more gradual approach to reforms in this area, and we have to try to tailor-make these things to national circumstances, and we have to look at trade adjustment. So that's the kind of policy thing that one comes out with when you start thinking about trade liberalization. I think the days of heterodox rapid liberalization are probably not there, given we're in the midst of a trade war, although there are those who also talk about unilaterally just cutting tariffs and opening countries up, but I don't think it's going to happen that easily. The second kind of barrier is about the ports and about the time it takes to clear goods in ports. And you have 2 indicators in this chart. The blue, which is the quality of port infrastructure, which comes from the World Economic Forum, and border compliance in terms of the time to import is what comes out of the World Bank Doing Business Service. And what you get is an interesting pattern. You get Singapore, which has very high quality port, and border compliance is very quick. So Singapore's hours to do things days is really very easy. Hours and days to clear goods are very easy. Other countries are more difficult. UAE is trending towards Singapore, but not quite the same quality and not the same border compliance quality in Singapore. And then India has pretty good quality of port, somewhat better than Sri Lanka, or at least equivalent, but border compliance is a problem in terms of time to import and customs issues. In Sri Lanka, they've put a lot of emphasis into improving the customs recently, and that's been an interesting factor, at least captured by these surveys. Now, when you come at the kind of policy side to this thing, clearly there needs to be much more public money in ports and logistics and customs and things of that type, and that's got to be the big driver. You also have the story that has these mega regional infrastructure initiatives, and we can come back to that in the chat. China's Belt and Road is well known, but you also have Japan's Quality Infrastructure Partnership. Now, these things offer additionality, but there are lots of health warnings. There's a debt issue which is there, and some people talk about some countries in Asia being in debt trap diplomacy. You've got the social and environmental issues which are there, and you also have the whole rent-seeking storyline which comes with this. We have the story of white elephant projects. So what really countries have to do is to try to balance their need for these investments, particularly in ports and customs, with the increased challenges they bring. And you really have to have infrastructure master planning. I think that is one of the key things that a lot of the indebted countries that have gone through the BRI route haven't done properly. And India has master planning, ASEAN master plan is very well known, etc., etc. We have to do this. I couldn't resist throwing in Hambantota because I think this would be of some interest to this audience. Essentially, in a nutshell, it wasn't on the BRI map when they did the map because it had come before the map. BRI map was 2013. It came in a province that had 2 insurrections in southern Sri Lanka, and you had a president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who wanted to sort of accelerate the rate of development in his province as part of his logic to it. And it kind of soon became a classic white elephant project, which suffered major losses. The new national government of Sirisena and Wickremesinghe basically renegotiated with China, and they struck a landmark PPP deal. And essentially, China Merchant Port provided 1 billion for a 70% stake with the Ports Authority on a 99-year lease. Now, some interesting questions. Was this a good deal? Did we get enough money for this? Was 99 years too long? Lots of questions in Sri Lanka, as well as when you compare these with other similar restructuring deals in other countries that have run into BRI are there.
Good deal for the Chinese.
We can certainly come in the chat. Risk sharing was one aspect of it. And then there's the whole security side of this. And part of the agreement was that the Sri Lankan Navy will regulate the port visits. So there are attempts to try to address some of the concerns. I just want to flag this as a fun topic, and we can undoubtedly come back in the chat. The other fun bit of it was this, and I tried to take a look at this. And a colleague of mine has written a sort of a policy brief on this, which we're going to put out. And so this is, you saw those numbers of the Indian ports, right? Not so big, 15, 16 million TEUs, not that big when you think about its size, right? And you saw the border compliance issues. So hopefully this is going to try to address some of that, right? And so one is, in Sri Lanka, they worry a lot about the competitive side of this story, right? And will this challenge, Colombo's transshipment port and so on? So there's this competition side to this. And then is there some sort of complementary relationship? Will the large ships come in from Dubai and Singapore? They stop off in Colombo and then get broken off and sent to the smaller ports and the rest of it and so on. There's some interesting debates here as to what this ultimately will mean from a regional perspective, right? Rather than an Indian perspective, I'm thinking about what it does for regional trade. And so there are these two different views, and there is also the provocative thing. I've been to Hambantota and I've been to Colombo port, and I've seen what the Chinese are trying to do with the restructuring of those ports. And one is, leaving aside the debt and the other issues, one is quietly impressed with their efficiency. And China Merchant Ports is a very good company. So somehow Sri Lanka has got the best of the Chinese state-owned enterprises, which are in Australia, they're in the US, wherever, and they're providing some sort of competitive edge in the way that a large strategic investor does. And the interesting question is, will that enable Sri Lanka, if you believe in the competitive theory, to outcompete some of the Indian ports that are coming through Sagamala, or will it ultimately lead to some sort of complementary edge? One of the terminals. 3 others are Sri Lankan. And I saw the terminal in Colombo that the Chinese have done, and they've done some very impressive things with that terminal. And we can talk about it in the chat in terms of the technology they've put and the efficiencies and so on. And there are some port efficiency indicators which we're trying to pick up in our study, and I can tell you more about it if Rakesh would kindly invite me back in the future, if I'm lucky. The third interesting gap is about development gaps, and the graph shows you the variation of development across this sub-region, and you have the low-income LDCs in Africa. Sri Lanka is just at this kind of low and middle-income threshold, and then you have the rest. And then the other story is that a lot of these countries will graduate from concessionary assistance as they reach middle income status, right? So you will not get the grant money anymore. And there's this whole kind of missing middle of development finance. And there's a story about donors really not moving from, basically an aid grant story to no aid at all. There needs to be some story about knowledge and also middle income assistance in different forms. And we've got to have ultimately more PPPs. Because there are these risks of income shocks and inequality in this Indian Ocean region. And so this becomes another storyline in terms of a challenge, right? And how do donors play a role in these middle income challenges?
Australia has got Indian Ocean strokes.
I'm sorry?
Australia has got Indian Ocean strokes.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing on how large this area can be. There can be a narrow definition.
Western borders of Australia. I think there was a map with the colored one which showed that expanse of the Indian Ocean.
It's huge.
It's striking.
It's huge. It's really huge when you start thinking in terms of economic analysis, Then you have this issue, which is about, the nascent regional institutions. And when you look at what's in here, there's a whole kind of, spaghetti bowl of these things, right? You have COMESA, you have SADC, you have East Asian Community, you have GCC, BIMSTEC, APEC, etc. And then you have this IORA somewhere, right? And so each of these things has its own sub-regional stories, but you only have this IORA as one sort of thing that goes across it, but it's really very weak. The limited mandate, countries don't want to delegate, they have lack of structure, it goes on. One of the weakest things, in the paper we have a nice table that sets out, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of each of these institutions, and you come to the conclusion, in the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and it's in Mauritius, and trying to provide some governance to this space, right? And it cuts across Africa right through to Asia and beyond, and there are some observer members and so on. So you come to the idea that really IORA needs perhaps some strengthening, but you don't want to kind of come out arbitrarily, and probably appointing an eminent persons group may be a kind of a first step to come up with some sort of plan. And ASEAN did this, right, as they thought of their approach, and they debated this widely, and maybe this is something we should be thinking about if we want to strengthen the governance of this. And then we have something that, you know, a lot of you all know a lot more than I do, the maritime security dimension. And clearly, you know, we have two dimensions of this. One is the naval arms race issue. And I was reading somewhere recently that, you know, there's an Asian arms race that is taking place in the naval side. And, you know, you have the South China Sea phenomenon of, you know, these two destroyers that came within 50 meters of each other, and the risks that that could have had. And there are these, I understand, rules about ship movement between each other and things like that. But, you know, we need to have perhaps some greater enhancement of some of those things. And then there's the whole issue of the submarine cables. It's something I learned recently. These carry the internet under the ocean, and you know, they can be hit by submarines of different types, and then that would knock out the digital economy. So there's a real security threat there that I didn't really think of. And then we have these non-traditional threats, which are a problem: piracy, drugs, illegal fishing, which is another problem. And then you have the idea that UNCLOS, you know, is there, but it's, some say, not effective for the present day. Things like piracy, I believe, are a problem. Drugs are another problem. And then reforming it is very difficult. But clearly we need to start thinking about improved ways of trying to do this, or maybe applying UNCLOS better. That's another school of thought. And the notion of soft law being very important rather than the hard law, because trying to get a treaty in a current global atmosphere is going to be very difficult. So then coming to Sri Lanka's initiative, essentially, and to try to give you a little bit of backdrop. So the Rajapaksa government very much was seen to have tilted more to China and away from Sri Lanka's non-aligned stance that it had sort of embedded in its approach to foreign policy since independence, really, and it, you know, was influenced by the non-aligned movement and things of that type. So a key tenet of this 2015 unity government was to try to reset the foreign policy, to engage with a wider set of powers, as well as to try to address some of the post-conflict concerns in Sri Lanka. Human rights were one, you know, balanced development across the country was another, and things of that type. And the sort of less known bit is Sri Lanka's ambition to position itself as a trading hub in the Indian Ocean, along with a non-aligned power. So a key aspect of this was really trying to pursue this rules-based order, and you see some of the storyline along that. And this essentially, you know, stems from other smaller countries that lack, you know, significant military power. So you have Singapore that has tried to do this in the ASEAN context. You have New Zealand in the Pacific that has done this very much as a small power. You have the Netherlands in Europe that have essentially tried, you know, face these risks of different types and have tried to adopt this. So Sri Lanka convened this conference on October 11th and 12th, defining our future, and we convened this important event to try to understand this. And the Prime Minister highlighted the need to maintain freedom of navigation, and he also talked about freedom of digital connectivity across the region. And really, he expressed a sort of a desire to have this ministerial conference to try to arrive at a shared understanding on the future of the ocean. Now, of course, given that 2 weeks afterwards we had this kind of so-called constitutional coup, where President Sirisena dismissed the Prime Minister and appointed Mahinda Rajapaksa back. A real Shakespearean irony, I think. They're probably reading Hamlet, I guess, is the best thing that I would assume with this. We think, you know, and in view of the sort of heightened tension between US and China and more complicated geopolitics, it's probably likely that this attempt at doing an initiative, has some uncertainties and a thorny path. But I feel that Sri Lanka is probably going to carry on with its patient diplomacy, but also will have to work much more closely with India and with others to try to make this happen. Because what we really don't want to happen here, and I say the we as the royal we, ourselves and the other countries in the ocean, we don't want a South China Sea phenomenon in this ocean. And we've got to think in a much more structured manner on how to make this all happen.
Did India participate in the conference?
Yes, the Deputy National Defense Advisor, Security Advisor.
Deputy NSA was there.
This
Yeah.
one was-
Yeah.
No, there would have
Others.
been others as well, but I mean,
He was there.
Pankaj Saran.
That's right. So essentially, in conclusion, trying to use an economic lens on this, already interesting security and IR story is very interesting. You get a slightly different take, and you get some interesting numbers, and a lot of it, of course, depends on how you cup that Indian Ocean. Right? You could have IRA 21 countries. We thought about that, but we thought maybe some excluded would not be so good. But you could do exactly the same thing if you wanted the IRA numbers for some reason, and you get these kinds of stories. So the sea story is slowing, the trade story in GDP is slowing, multiple risks are there, and even if you take the lower rates of growth of these things and you project them forward, you get a bigger Indian Ocean economy in the future, and slightly richer one, and India and Sri Lanka are likely to play important roles in this. Many risks, and here are some of the things that we may want to think about as we go forward to think about how we get a better Indian Ocean governance in the legal sense, and Indian Ocean governance in the economic development sense of better trade and development, but also regional governance being strengthened at the regional institution level. And then Sri Lanka's initiative is really a classic story of a small country that wants to try to attempt to champion some of these things along with others, and at least get a conversation going. And that's how I sort of try to interpret this. And so if you all are interested, there are a couple of pieces you can look at. This is the working paper, which we have published on the website of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute. And then those who don't want to read 40, 50 pages of stuff can read 2 or 3 really nice pages that are in East Asia Forum, which tell you the summary of some of this, and focusing more on the geopolitics. So this is where it is for now. And I'm writing a sort of an enhanced version of this at the moment as we speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's quite a fascinating presentation. I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is that, if we try and look at the Indian Ocean from the perspective that you have drawn out for us, it means that clearly we are looking at 2 significant players. One, of course, is India because of its size and because of the huge coastline that it has abutting the Indian Ocean. And second, of course, is Sri Lanka because it's sitting right there, and in the region it has among the best developed port facilities and is ideally placed to benefit from an uptick in the Indian Ocean economy in that sense. Which means at one level that any initiative on the Indian Ocean is something that would require India and Sri Lanka to work together, obviously. You can't have an initiative. It would be very difficult for India to take an initiative and sell something to the rest of the region if Sri Lanka was not on board that. And vice versa is equally true. If Sri Lanka took an initiative and India was not on board, it won't work. It won't carry conviction. So, the idea of developing this, which obviously means that Sri Lanka growing as a hub, and the idea of India developing its port capabilities, how does that look? Does that create room for both countries to be able to work together, or does it create the risk of a competitive approach, which means that there is a reluctance? How do both countries look at it strategically? Because that is one of the vital things. And second question, which I think you did address to an extent on Hambantota, I mean, how has that changed perceptions about China in Sri Lanka? Because Hambantota was just one very visible part of Chinese investment in Sri Lanka. There are a lot of other examples of growing Chinese influence and investment in Sri Lanka. So, but because Hambantota was so visible, so how did that change Sri Lankan perceptions in that sense about BRI and all of that? So they're two separate questions, but if you can perhaps kick it off with that, and then we can open up for additional questions from others.
Thank you, Rakesh. As always, very sharp, very clear questions. Let me try to answer the second one first, which is about China and Sri Lanka. So, essentially, China is sort of there to stay in the Sri Lankan context, the way they've come in. And these are long-term projects. What one has to try to do in Sri Lanka is to avoid upsetting India or anyone else, including the US that is there. And when you look at the port call statistics of navies to Sri Lanka, you see that. So there have been, I forget the exact number, but India has the highest number of port calls in Sri Lanka in the last decade. And then I think US, China, Japan, etc. are there. So that gives you an implicit ranking of degrees of worry, if you like, right, in some way. Of Sri Lanka. I mean, all the port calls are R&R and all of that, but it also gives you a sense of, and we had, I think, large US aircraft carrier a couple of weeks ago, and they're very impressive ships. And Prime Minister Wickremesinghe said there are more ships on this thing than the entire Sri Lankan Air Force. So, it's an interesting, it's an interesting thing when you're in a small country. But so I think our challenge in Sri Lanka is to try to come up with a storyline where we can somehow take a fresh look at Chinese investment projects, particularly in the port city, which is coming up rather fast, 269 acres just off the commercial center of Colombo. The Matala Airport, which is this huge airport, which is needed as Colombo Airport is highly congested now. Hambantota is another. We have the telecom tower, which is the carbon copy of the Shanghai Telecom Tower, and so on. And it has that sphere of influence. And we're trying to understand better how do we manage the risks. And my institute, coincidentally, is doing a study with Chatham House on Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, and we're doing the field work as we speak, trying to work out what principles we can use to guide Chinese investment based on lessons from past projects. And that would apply equally well to Japanese investments. The perception of China, I think some people are getting uncomfortable with it. But there is an interesting narrative in Sri Lanka about China. They don't yet see the way in which China is coming in. I see it fairly clearly, having worked across other countries in Southeast Asia and so on. Laos being one, Cambodia being another, and some of the African countries where I have worked before. They don't quite see it yet. And some people are a little bit naive, if you like, about this, and the security dimension follows the economics of it. So I hope our study will help, guide some thinking, and certainly it's also trying to address this debt trap diplomacy narrative or not of Sri Lanka in the future. So that's the short answer to that one. Is it's people don't quite see it, and we need to do a lot of work and try to convince people there are these issues of balance we've got to think about much more closely. On the issue,
when is your study with Chatham House? When does it come out?
So we are doing the workshop with Chatham House at the end of April in London, and I guess by May, June we'll publish. So it'll be quite soon, and I think IDRC, which helped fund it, also have asked us to do a presentation in Delhi in the autumn. So I'm sure it'll be a very detailed case study, and I spent 15 years of my life in a development bank, and one is trying to apply a development bank lens to some of this issue, and I think we could do something different to just a political analysis of this. We can take a hard look at the projects, that might be there. So I think we'll bring something new, and because of my privileged positions, I sit on the Prime Minister's Task Force on the Indian Ocean. I have the Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee. I think I'll get data, others won't. So let's see. Fingers crossed. If we do, it'll be great. On the India-Sri Lanka competition, India is so big that I don't think we are really a threat. I think the complementary story is what I think would happen. In some segments of transshipment trade, maybe Sri Lanka will be there. But India, don't forget, is a gateway country, right? So it has these ports which have manufacturing sectors linked to it. Sri Lanka has very little manufacturing. And the transshipment trade is very low value addition. So, I mean, that's the other sort of thing I'm looking at. I think I'm right, Prabir, aren't I? And I should have said Prabir was at this conference and he co-chaired the economic session with me, and he provided great support for us thinking about India-Sri Lanka relations. So that was really very nice, wasn't it, Prabir? And I hope you'll say something in the chat. So I think India is more complementary than competition because of the size issues eventually. So hopefully Sagamala or whatever else later will come in there and Indian ports will begin to gear up. The whole sea story is taking a dive, and in that story, I think some complementarity, I hope, will be the medium-term narrative.
Thanks. Yeah, can you please identify yourself and then pose the question or comment?
I'm Palak and I'm from press. I'm a journalist by profession. So my question could be a supplementary question to Ambassador Sood's question. Like, discussing the Indian Ocean economy, we talked of India, we talked of Sri Lanka. What about Chinese influence? In specific, the Colombo Port City project. I mean, 269 hectare land triumphantly has been reclaimed, and are we going to harbor, is Sri Lanka going to harbor any Chinese in that specific project? And we talk of debt diplomacy, and is China, pushing to transculturalization? And then there was how...
So China pushing for?
Transculturalization, like influencing the culture in that way. And then how is US-China trade kabuki gonna affect the entire picture of Sri Lanka with China and as well as India?
Gosh, how much time have you got?
Shall we take one or two?
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. An excellent presentation, as all of us. It's interesting to listen to you again in Delhi. Just one related question, with Ambassador Sood. See, IORA, which is, it's there for last 2-3 decades. But if you look at the IORA activities, they're more into non-trade areas. So if you do anything, or if you do any kind of a strategy with India and Sri Lanka coming as complementing each other, you need to have a very strong secretariat at IORA. Plus, you need to have, I think, kind of a free trade agreement, or comprehensive comprehensive trade agreement in the IORA. So there was a discussion happening, I don't exactly remember when. Some kind of a study we did looking at FTA in the IORA member countries. That didn't pick up the pace. Now again, when you talk about Indo-Pacific, this Indian Ocean and IORA coming again back to the discussion. So tell us something about how Sri Lanka and India can do in terms of picking up again the discussion about the FTA in IORA countries, because trade relation is very important. Second is, I have seen in the map when you are indicating Indian Ocean by the blues, green, and red, why Philippines was not exactly highlighted. Is it not in Pacific economy or Indian Ocean? The third one, can you tell us some information? There's Hambantota port. What's the current volume? Is it this port is handling any transshipment cargo or international cargo, or it is presently being used for the domestic transportation? Thank you.
I think that's for 6 or 7 questions.
Sure. So Chinese culture, Chinese influence on culture. So Chinese food in Colombo has improved very tremendously.
That's not it.
My best 5 restaurants, Chinese restaurants, I can tell you, it's where all the Chinese workers go to eat. And you go in there and you ask for Sri Lankan Chinese or Chinese. And I always ask for Chinese. And you get very good Chinese. And you have Chinese people running those restaurants. So that's the direct sign of what you see. On the port city, yes, there will be Chinese there. And I don't yet have the port city agreement in my hand, but I think some part of it will be run. There's a contractor. Some part of it, I think they will do condos. They will do. It's meant to be a financial center, right? So there are some evaluation studies going on as to, Sri Lankan government has great ambition, right? So they want to rival Singapore and Dubai and so on. But those are mature financial centers, right? So one of the things that Port City might do is to do some non-conventional trading. So cryptocurrency is one, right? Switzerland is a cryptocurrency center. These are ideas of mine, not what government is saying at the moment openly.
What is the timeline for this?
I think 20 years for it to happen.
20 years?
Yeah, I think 20 years. They just started the foundation.
No. The reason I ask
Yeah.
is because I think it's always good to put things in
Yeah.
a certain time perspective.
That's right. So I think in 10 years we'll see the initial things properly there, and then 20 years by the time it gets going, right? These things always take longer than you think, because you have to get a regulatory structure around it and things of that type. And there's some discussion of whether English law will be there to govern, the rules in that port city. But then some people say that's against the Sri Lankan constitution that only allows Sri Lankan law to govern things. And so a lot of those debates happening. So we're at very early stages. But if you come to Colombo, you'll see lots of cranes along that port city complex. And you'll see things, beginning to happen. They've got the 260 acres reclaimed, and they had a big tamasha with the foundation stones laid and various things happening a few weeks ago. So we have to see, and I think it's still, they have had a few feasibility studies, so we have to see what's going to happen. Chinese will be there undoubtedly, but whether it's China, or it's overseas Chinese from Taiwan and Hong Kong and whatever, I think they'll all be there in some form, and hopefully Indians will also come. I don't think anyone will be excluded. It'll be a financial center. The real question for me is, can Sri Lankans find jobs there, given our education system? And that to me is the bigger issue, rather than Chinese being there. Chinese will be there, and others. But can Sri Lankans join? And that would be the key point from the domestic linkages side. On US, China, and Sri Lanka and India, gosh, that's really difficult. But I think the trade war will definitely, from China's restructuring of trade, there will be many industries that leave China, and some of them, and some numbers I've done, if you're free, come to tomorrow. I'm giving a talk on China's restructuring the value chain in Korea. And the short answer is Chinese firms are going in the labor-intensive industries, and they're going Indonesia, India, and Vietnam. These are 3 target points. So it'll get that benefit side. But India may also suffer a hit as global trade and regional trade also takes a hit, right? So there are these 2 influences, and we'll have to see what happens. Sri Lanka will also benefit, hopefully, but also suffer both effects, right? As US demand goes down. So hard to tell. We'll have to, watch and see. But if global trade collapses, then I think the net effect on the hit will be greater than the other. So, there are these hard things to say. Prabir has always very useful questions. India and Sri Lanka and FTA and IRA, I think maybe one might want to start some discussion of some sort of story for the poor African countries. That would be what I would say. Rather than FTA, maybe some sort of GSP type system, where the poorest African countries might get some preferential access to the Indian and Sri Lankan markets, on the assumption that Sri Lanka and India are better integrated through ECTA. There is a better SARC agreement down the line. Then I think IRA can offer some access for these countries of Africa to come in. IRA FTA, I think, would be further down the line, right? We've seen the BIMSTEC FTA, 14 years, not much progress. But maybe some pieces can be there, building with the GSP for the poorer countries. That's the way I would see it. And some bilaterals may be good between some of the African countries. And so I think that's the way we may want to go, rather than some sort of grand FTA. I don't see that so easily in the current atmosphere. Philippines not being there, gosh, when I did this map, it was a tough call as to, sorry, this is something disappeared. Can we get back the map, possibly? That's possible. If we can. Anyway, the Philippines, so it was a question of how far you can go down the track. And once one went beyond IORA, the 21 countries, one sort of tried very hard to sort of see which country had any semblance of Indian Ocean. And I think it's also possible that a country like the Philippines could be a dialogue partner to such a thing in the future. Our expansion, dialogue partners, and something of that type. So, in that sense, no country per se that has some regional connection, not necessarily the sea, is not ruled out. Hamansara port at the moment has begun to function. They've started a little bit of transshipment cargo, but I think it's still early stages. So when we visited earlier on, because there was originally someone else who ran the port, and China Merchant Port isn't quite happy with the way they've set up that port. So they want to do more with the port. So I just get to the map so that this refreshes your mind. Yeah, there's the map. So Philippines would be out there. Somebody said, why not Vietnam? So these can all be potentially dialogue partners. So you think here, and some of this is stretching it a little bit, right? I mean, when you think of the ocean, but it goes quite far down. That's the point I want to make, and I didn't differentiate between the literals and the others. And it gives a slightly different take than if you think of just the blue economy, which is essentially the water, from what I understand, and the bits of the land that are linked to the ocean trade. I understand that's what I think it is. I've been trying to understand the blue economy concept, and I understand. So it's the stuff in the water, the fish stocks plus the minerals, plus the bits of the land that are linked to the water trade. Yeah? And we have a much broader definition because of the natural linkages through some sort of input-output table. And since we can't quite calibrate it, I thought let's just think of this at least as a macro construct, and you get a better way of looking at this whole thing rather than a very narrow sectoral thing of sustainability and so on. I think it's a bigger concept. That's what I just think and I come at it from a very different lens, and people may agree or not. So Hambantota, by the way, as you asked, is early days, and I think we've got to develop it as we go. And I think the game changer will be the industrial zone, not the port. And China is trying to do some interesting things with the industrial zone, China Merchant Port. So one story I heard, this Japanese second-hand cars are very popular in Africa. And they're very popular in Sri Lanka and other places. And currently they get, and they're really popular for two reasons. One is that Japanese are Sunday drivers. Okay, if you live in Tokyo or Osaka or somewhere, you don't drive your car during the week much because it's expensive, and then they buy, and then the quality of the cars in Japan, some cases are better than what they export. So there's a whole story of inverse quality story. And they have to get rid of their cars, or they want to get rid of their cars within a few years. So Japanese cars are a very nice product if you buy them second-hand, right? And you get the depreciation value from it being second-hand. So anyway, China Merchant Port in Sri Lanka, this sort of cars get refurbished currently in Singapore, which is very high cost. Yeah? Right, and by refurbishment they put in new tires, change the oil. I mean, we're talking about maybe a bit of a clean. You're not talking about refurbishment and changing the engine and doing dramatic things or making them left-hand to right-hand drive or none of that stuff. It's just so China Merchant Port is talking about doing some of that sort of thing in the Sri Lankan zone. Yeah, very logical to me because our labor is cheaper, etc., etc. Now, how much of it they'll do and all, who knows. So the industrial zone will be the game changer, and I think they're still doing the zone. I'll be going again in a few weeks, so I'll see that. And but I think eventually they will get it going. I think they will, because you've got such an important investor there. And they did Piraeus Port, they did the one in the US, I forget where, they've done the one in Darwin. So I mean, just from cyberspace or from Mars, as if you're looking at it as an investment prospect, China Merchant Port is one of their best companies. And I think they will do a good job. And there's some very serious people there. They're not usual state-owned enterprise crowd. So we'll have to see.
Ashok Lahiri, I have 3 comments. One, looking at there's some 2 dozen countries, the Indian Ocean economy is intractable. I don't know of any economic association, ASEAN, or what is the European community, starting with such a large unwieldy number of countries. So it's a good family, but something like a dysfunctional joint family. So, second is the issue of Sri Lanka and India. Now, Ganesh, you make that point which is important, that India is so big, it doesn't really matter, but it does. I remember very well when FTA was being talked, It's the coconut growers in India.
The India-Sri Lanka
A very small proportion of Indian population, but in such a vibrant democracy it hurts, and the political leaders start shouting this. So now if you think of India-Sri Lanka FTA as a proportion what it will do to Sri Lanka and what it will do to India, you're right. India we won't be able to see much of a perceptible difference. In Sri Lanka you will. That's the reason must be some give and take. I'm not from the Ministry of External Affairs or from the government in that sense of the term, but I don't know how the deal can be sweetened so that an FTA can go through. I don't think Indians would love to do it for the love of it. And Sri Lanka has to give something. What will it give? And I don't know. So that's the second issue. Third is about China. I don't think China has built Hambantota because they love the Sri Lankans. I don't think Chinese have built Hambantota because they'll make money. So that is the worrying part. When you say there is no South China Sea, is it that the South China Sea has already started in the Indian Ocean? And Indians being naive, they don't even recognize that it is happening.
Can we take a couple of questions?
Yeah, I think
very
this
good question.
requires some deep. Uday, you've been.
Absorbing.
Sorry, anybody else? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm Sarthak, I'm from the Economist Intelligence Unit. You said that the countries are not yet seeing how China is coming in, and that
Sri Lanka has not. I mean.
yeah, you mentioned Africa as well, that they are not seeing how they're coming in, and that they are somewhat naive. Do you mean that, as Sir just said, that there is some ulterior motive or strategic agenda that China has, or is it just the case that that's what happens when countries go through an economic boom and expand their influence around their neighbors? Because there was a news, I think a month ago, that China has actually cut the number of projects under BRI for Nepal, and that is coming from the Chinese side. That's not coming from the Nepal's concerns about debt. So, what do you have to say about that?
Anybody else?
I'm Hanif. So regarding the constant bone of contention between India and Sri Lanka about the fishermen in the Park state. So what is a long-term solution? I mean, what is a probable solution? Like for example, in the case of tsunamis and in the disaster relief, we have something called early warning system, RIMES. So can't we work on the on this issue which has been there, which has been affecting India-Sri Lanka relation throughout?
No, thank you very much. Let me start with the last question. So the fishermen issue has been a difficult one over the last few years, and I'm not familiar with all the detail, but I understand it's about the fish stocks that are plentiful in Sri Lanka, and we don't have the deep trawlers, and so it's not just Indian trawlers that are coming, but also Chinese and Taiwanese trawlers, which are these very large boats that come and mop up the fish. So there's a general problem for a country like Sri Lanka. It's not just India issue. Now politicians have been, some politicians, one right and left wing thing is there in Sri Lanka. So one politician was on record saying, let's sink these fishing ships. Now, how silly can you get? So, in my view, linked to some sort of diplomacy, that's a very silly reaction, I feel. But clearly, we have to have not just early warning, but we have to have cooperation between the navies, cooperation between the countries, And there are some conventions to deal with trawling, I believe, which are there. And so I think we need to activate that whole gambit of things. And has to be discussed. And I think there are some fishermen in jails in both countries and things like that. I think those issues also have to be solved out through proper discussion. So I think that's very clear. The idea that you sink somebody's boats, particularly for a small country, is very silly. But I mean, this is the kind of knee-jerk reaction you get, from some local politicians. So this sort of thing has to be this thing. China and its ulterior motive, which both Ashok and you raised, you see, there is both a supply and a demand. So China's BRI or whatever they want to call it, there was surplus cash to put somewhere. Sri Lanka was wanting some of this. And during the Rajapaksa era, they called the Chinese in, okay, to do Hambantota. I mean, he tried to do it himself through Sri Lankan means.
Well,
It
they
didn't
offered
succeed.
it to India, and India.
That's right, India said no.
So it said no to
Yeah.
Hambantota earlier,
That's right.
citing economic unviability.
That's right. And then the Chinese came in, and the Chinese are, I don't think they did it because of Sri Lanka's, big development potential. They were asked to come in. There was a political motive, plus they want to be friendly with Rajapaksa, where they saw a long-standing relationship, and they came in to do this. Now, again, this thing about the rock. So the rock was there in front of the port, and it cost $100 million to blast the rock. So the $100 million went to blasting a rock. Why didn't you develop Galle Port, which is nearby? Or indeed Trincomalee Port, which is the huge natural harbour, and where we have it's enormous. So that comes when you start looking at infrastructure master planning. No such thing was done. So clearly non-economic issues came into play, both on the Sri Lankan side as well as the Chinese side. And how much of it is string of pearls, this and the other, I can't really tell you. I mean, I can tell you in a few weeks when we finished our study. But clearly it's more than just the economics. I'm not sure if they intentionally wanted to get Sri Lanka into some sort of debt trap thing. I don't think that was intentionally there. There was some story about, it's about the traffic flows, right? When you work in a development bank, you sense that it's about the traffic flows, right? And probably the projections were very ambitious, to say the least, right? And nobody thought of the connectivity between Hambantota Port, which is in the middle of nowhere. Yeah.
999.
99 now.
Not 990.
No, 99, yes. Not 2,500 years of Chinese history in Sri Lanka, thankfully. So they didn't look at the traffic flows, they didn't look at the associated infrastructure, they didn't look at the skill base. So it would fail any development bank type project because none of those conditions, which you sat on the board of ADB or in the case of the IMF, World Bank would be met. So Chinese are keeping their cash. They want to put it around the place. They want to show, whatever it is. That's there. Effects on India, Sri Lanka. Now that's an interesting one. And, just as much as the Sri Lankans need to give something, the Indians may want to. Sri Lanka is a small market, right? So it's. I mean, all there is the services story, right? So there's already paranoia. So we have this agreement with Singapore, which has been signed, and there's utter paranoia in the Sri Lankan political circle and so on, and where we've said we're going to renegotiate the Singapore agreement. Now, the Singapore agreement, for me, and I've written a bit about this elsewhere, is that it would have brought in a lot of FDI and probably got some kind of technical assistance from Singapore to upgrade our whole FDI structure, promotion structure. Instead of which we find ourselves talking to Singapore about renegotiating it. And the point I want to make is, even with an innocuous country like Singapore for Sri Lanka, which can only help it get into East Asia and beyond, that hasn't come out in any possible way because of the domestic reaction. We have a few very powerful lobbies. In the case of India, and it's the professionals, so it's the architects, the lawyers, the doctors. I mean, they think, for instance, Singaporean doctors want to come and work in Sri Lanka at 1/20th the wage. The logic to me isn't very clear. And then you hear some story about lots of Indian doctors having registered in Singapore and they want to come in Sri Lanka. Maybe one or two. I can't believe this is a mass thing. So lobbies are making a big storyline. I think we need to really look hard at the economics of it. We need to have some discussion. And I think Indian aid may need to be looked at more closely in the way in which Indian aid is done in a country like Sri Lanka. At the moment it's mostly humanitarian, which is very good in many ways. But I think maybe some economic restructuring imperative. While the pockets aren't deep as the Chinese, I think one can think of some ideas. And I have a few thoughts in my mind.
Can I just one more
Sure.
thing that I wanted to comment on? You
Sure.
said about some special deals for the African countries. I think that would be a wrong way to start. If you want to seduce these guys, you have to tell them there is money to be made. If you tell them do some altruistic thing, do good to the Africans, I don't think it will sell. do that later.
Mm.
You can't have an economy, Indian Ocean economy, which is based on altruism and do good. That's being unrealistic.
And you're right. I mean, there's a specialization that will come. No, African commodities for Asian manufacturers. So that, I mean, that's the basic point which will come, right? And they have land. But there's also a backlash against China and Africa. So I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right. That's how one has to do it. There. And the last point you made about the thing about the intractable thing, I think we could have picked any storyline and there would have been complexity given the countries. You know, this was just a construct we brought up. IRA itself is dysfunctional because of this. You know? So it's a kind of a South Asian. I mean, given that South Asian cooperation in SAARC hasn't really worked, given that BIMSTEC is having difficulty, Sri Lanka is going to be chair of it this year. One is thinking of some other storyline which might provide some other thing. Now, one can take a line that regionalism isn't going to work. Unilateralism is what we need to do, and that may well be right. But one is thinking of a different way. That's all. You know, thinking of the Africa growth corridor type thing, going that way more importantly. I think I've dealt with the issues.
Okay. Thank you, Ganesh. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and but Ashok is right. I mean, you know, when you were talking about the fact that the point he was making is that somehow or the other India tends to be a little touchy when it comes to its neighbors. I mean, we've seen the case of Nepal, India-Nepal, in recent years, and not a very happy kind of an experience. So there would be a certain expectation. Now, how do we deal with it, these expectations, as it were? I mean, yes, India would be prepared to be generous as befitting a larger neighbor kind of thing, but then there would also be a certain expectation. So how do we finesse this in terms of that? And you know, is requires a lot of deft political handling, as it were. And also regional politics in India claims its own toll. We've seen that with Bangladesh. We saw you know, the agreements, the land boundary agreement with Bangladesh, or the Tista waters, which still hasn't come into being yet, how regional politics has impacted the central government's ability to be able to conclude these agreements. And you know, Tamil politics is another sort of difficult, troubled area that any central government will have to navigate depending on which party is in power and how that thing happens and so on. But anyway, I mean, thank you very much for a fascinating conversation, and we look forward to when you come out with your with your report by the middle of the year. Thank you all, and please join us for a cup of tea in the room next door. Thank you very much.